All right, today is July the 10th in 2025, and my guest is John Martin Fischer. John is Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the University of California, Riverside, best known for his influential work on free will, moral responsibility, death, and the meaning of life. John, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
John, we met at Vitalist Day in San Francisco. What was your experience like there? What brought you there?
It was great. Because I've written on death and immortality, I got connected with a few philosophers. Patrick Linden is one, the Swedish philosopher, John Davis, another. And I had a big grant from the Templeton Foundation about a decade ago called the Immortality Project. And through these connections, I think that's why I was invited by Adam Grease. And I had a wonderful time, really. It was very interesting. It was very eye opening to me because I have written about the philosophy of immortality. And I know of some of the groups who are actively pursuing science of immortality and medicine pertaining to immortality. But I did not know the specific groups that were at the Vitalist Band. That was just totally fascinating to me. So I had a very good time, and I'd like to continue to get to know the what I would call the movement
Yeah,
uh,
yeah.
better.
Yeah, I was actually wondering about that. If you already involved before in some of the practitioners that work on technology, it's like the scientists or the entrepreneurs, or especially since you're in the Bay Area, or was that sort of a bit of a parallel conversation between philosophy and the practitioners?
Actually, you came in and out there, so let's start there again. Could you ask the question again?
Yeah, sure. So the question was, if in the Bay Area there's like lots of groups and like scientists and entrepreneurs who are working on life extension, I was wondering if you were connected to these groups and how that evolved over time, or was there kind of a parallel track between
Yeah,
discussing the philosophy
right,
and
right,
the. Yeah.
right. Actually, it's very interesting because it is parallel. They're parallel universes in a way. First of all, it's because partly because I just mainly do the philosophy. Now, I am interested from an intellectual point of view in the ethics and the medicine of life extension. I do follow certain podcasts, one by Peter Attia, one by Rhonda Patrick, and they kind of focus on some practical measures you can take for greater longevity and higher quality of life. But I'm not an activist in the sense that I've never kind of been involved in lobbying and the kind of the practical politics of it. So that was really great. And I learned more about the libertarians and the right to try movement and the movement in New Hampshire and Montana. Those were all eye openers to me, and I want to learn more about it. But yeah, it's more parallel universes, and that's one of the exciting things. As I hope to learn more, and I hope that some of the people who are in your more practical movement will learn something more about the philosophy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was also parallel for me for a while, right? I found the idea very appealing. My background is also in philosophy. Um, And but I didn't see that there was a practical possibility, so that raised some urgency in me that we have to make this actually happen.
Right,
But I'm wondering, how did you get into the question in the first place about
right,
immortality and life extension?
right. I'll back up 1 second to what you said. I think when I started thinking seriously about these issues and reading the philosophy and teaching it, there wasn't the practical application. That was 30, 35 years ago. There just wasn't. And then over these 3, 4 decades, we've developed our understanding of aging from a medical point of view and the technology. And what was interesting also at the Vitalist Bay was there are people interested in crypto, AI, longevity, and all of these are relatively new for someone of my age. So that's been interesting. Now, I am a philosophy person, and my first job was at a great Ivy League university, Yale University, and I was asked to teach an introductory course and also some mid-level courses where I used contemporary philosophical work on death and immortality. And one of the papers I used was a very famous paper by the British philosopher Bernard Williams, and he also taught part-time at Berkeley. So he wrote a famous paper arguing that we shouldn't, it's not rational to choose immortality. If you could choose it, if you could take a pill that would make you, live for 300 more years naturally, you wouldn't die of a natural death. Should you choose that? And he argued, no, that no human being should choose that. And I taught it, and I was wondering, first of all, I just thought that conclusion was crazy and intuitively just didn't resonate with me. And then secondly, I just didn't find the arguments compelling. So as I taught it, then I came to the University of California in Southern California, Riverside, and I kept teaching and thinking, and I started writing critiques of that famous paper. And I published my first paper on immortality, arguing that, as I said, immortality is why immortality is not so bad, because I'd written a paper called "Why Death Is Bad," and that was 30 years ago. And over time, I've replied to critics, and I've thought more and developed my ideas more. So that's kind of how I got into the philosophy. Um, I think some of us just also, as human beings, as we grow up, are more fascinated by or even preoccupied with death. What is death? What happens after we die? Could we avoid it? And so I was that kind of guy when I was young.
Yeah. I mean, what was it though that maybe we can talk about that paper actually. What
Sure.
was the case of that paper, or what are kind of, the arguments you encounter that are pro-death or against
Yeah,
immortality?
right. Yeah, I'd be happy to. In that paper, Bernard Williams goes back to a well known, or at least in this literature, well known play by the Czech playwright Karel Čapek, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. And it was then made into an opera by Leos Janáček. This was late 19th century, early 20th century. And it was about the character, the main character, the protagonist was called E.M. Those were her initials because she had different names as she got older. And at the time of the play, she was 330 years old, approximately, chronologically. And Alina Macropolis was her name. So the paper's called The Macropolis Case, Reflections on the Tedium of Immortality. And that paper, I mean, the title kind of gives it away because one of the main ideas that Williams wants to present and defend is that immortality, in the sense of living forever and not dying, would essentially and necessarily be tedious or boring. So eventually, Alina's projects and her relationships and what she cared about became kind of fell away, and she was no longer engaged with life. And so, to be more specific, she was the daughter of a court physician, medieval court physician, who had created an elixir, and that elixir, if you took it, would give you 300 more years, where you weren't biologically deteriorating and you wouldn't die of organ failure or aging. But you could still die. You could still walk off a cliff or whatever. But so at the time of the play, she's considering whether to take it for the second time to get 300 more years. And basically, she reflects and says, everything that could happen to me has happened. I've had relationships, I've had marriages, I and nothing really matters to me anymore. Everything is boring and alienating. And that was essentially William's main argument. And a lot of folks, philosophers, before him and after have said something like that. There are other arguments um, as well in the paper, and that his followers, William's followers, have picked up in philosophy. It's interesting because I love getting to know you and people at Vitalist Bay and kind of reading about people in the transhumanist and life extension literature because you're pro immortality. And yet, most philosophers, I'd say, on the contemporary scene are anti for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean,
yeah,
there's several other, arguments that I've often been thinking about and others have put forward. The boringness argument seems the most unintuitive to me, right?
yeah,
Especially coming from philosophers or from like intellectuals, because we get excited about new stuff, ideas all the
yeah,
time, right? So in
yeah,
terms of our personality profile, we're highly skewing towards openness to experience. So, you know, that seems like the least intuitive for me, at least coming,
yes,
especially coming from that crowd, right?
yes. To me, it was, like I said, I felt it was crazy. I felt the conclusion that it would not be rational ever to take 300 more years of life just seemed so unintuitive. And then the reason that we would inevitably become bored seemed unintuitive. And one right away, 300 years doesn't seem that long.
Yeah.
And it, you could, you're right, as philosophers, especially, we're intellectually curious. And there's always something new. There are new novels, there are new poems, there are new plays, there's new uh, theories in physics, in, cosmology, and in astrophysics, and in biology, and different views about politics. And there's so much out there that it's hard to imagine getting intellectually bored, at least in 300 years. Um, and then there's experience itself, all the compelling pleasures we get. And I don't know if spiritual experiences are exactly a pleasure, but they're positive and sometimes transformative.
Yeah.
Meditation, prayer. Why all of these projects and activities would inevitably become boring, I just found this unintuitive. But so many philosophers are attracted to that idea. And I don't know, that's a puzzle why. Um, sociologically, some great philosophers historically, and the contemporary philosopher Bernard Williams, they've had a big influence. And in philosophy, we're influenced and we kind of fall in line sometimes. But really, it goes back to Plato and Socrates. When Socrates was condemned to death and he was going to take the hemlock the next day, his comforters came to him and said, "Oh, don't worry, it won't be so bad." And he said, "Oh, no, of course, I'm looking forward to it because this world is transitory and full of contradictions and impurities. But I'll be going to the heaven of the forms." It wasn't, of course, a Judeo-Christian or any kind of religious heaven, but where there's permanence and beauty, uh, and that's interacting with what he called the forms, or these general properties or principles. It's controversial, but in any case, goes back to Socrates, and it goes through the history of philosophy. Heidegger, usually people interpret him as saying death gives meaning to life. So, right, I there are lots of different arguments, not just the boringness argument, but I've never found any of them compelling. I do find them interesting. That's okay. So, beside boringness, one idea is our lives have meaning, and they would not be meaningful if they didn't have boundaries or borders or finitude. If you think about a sculpture, for instance, it is what it is because of its borders and its shape. And if it didn't have those borders, it wouldn't be the same sculpture or a sculpture at all. And, I'm looking at my laptop and my desk, and those are the particular things they are, partly because they have definite shape. And maybe our lives have to have a definite shape in order to be meaningful. And some people interpret that as it can't go on forever. That would be a explosion of one of the dimensions by virtue of which something is what it is. So I've tried to engage with all of these arguments. Another one, sorry, I've kind of digressed from the idea of boredom, but we're listing different arguments here that the curmudgeons, the people who are pro-death, you could say, or anti-immortality, have put forward. So there's boredom, there's meaningfulness in life. Another idea is, in order to rationally choose the pill that would make you live 300 years longer or indefinitely longer, you'd have to be able to recognize that life as a human life. It would have to be recognizably human. And some people have argued in order to be a recognizable human life, it has to have stages, right? Our lives have stages. We're babies, we're infants, we're toddlers, we're young, we're adolescents, we're young adults, we're adults, we're elderly. And part of what it is to recognize a human being as a human being is to see that those stages are present. Now, if we were to live forever or 300 more years even, we would still have the beginning stages. But the, let's say, adulthood stage would now be long, much, much longer than what we can recognize as the ordinary, length and structure of the stages. So I've tried to address all of these.
Yeah. Yeah. My had to I was always wondering my first experience of how I thought about the question was a movie, and nobody in the longevity movie really knew the movie. It's called Only Lovers Left Alive by Jim Jarmusch.
Mm-hmm.
That has these two vampires played by Tilda Swinton and Tom Hiddleston and their model, and it was just so they were talking about how they met Shakespeare back in the days. They were
Yeah,
rereading books for the fifth or sixth time,
right,
but it was like in a very exciting way, right?
right,
And at the same time, the male vampire was kind of depressed and wanted to kill himself. And then she
right.
gives him the speech how he's not yet understood life, right?
Yeah,
And that's sort of going through bad times and good times is kind of part of it, and it's still good. So I found that a really profound and deep and beautiful message.
yes,
Um, yeah, wondering,
yeah.
are there other kind of pop cultural depictions of immortality, sort of both on the anti and for the pro immortality side, that you find have interesting perspectives?
By the way, I'm not familiar with the film. I'll have to see it.
Yeah.
But I do like Jim Jarmusch. I think he's very interesting, talented. Well, you know, there are, it's interesting because over time, and I won't be very specific because I'm not good at specific examples, but over time, in general, science fiction has become more dystopian and with regard to all the topics. And that's an unfortunate feature of the fact that the present seems to be getting worse and worse. And so there's the eco doom genre and the AI doom genre. And I forget the specific names, but there are various elements of science fiction that portray the future in a dark way. I guess Blade Runner was a famous version of that. There's an updated Blade Runner or a sequel. And the idea is that the environment will get increasingly dark and we'll be stuck with overpopulation and it just will not be attractive. Um, there are more positive depictions of the possibility of immortality in science fiction and literature. But what I would say, the the, the bulk of the literature is negative. That doesn't mean, that people in general feel that. Let me go back to the Jarmusch movie for a second. And one thing that's interesting is in uh, I had a grant that studied immortality, the Immortality Project, and one of the sub grants did some empirical work. I'm asking people questions. One of the things that came out was that males tend to be more pro immortality than females, which is kind of the inverse of the Jarmusch film. But of course, it's not universal, and it's interesting to try and figure out why that is. But right, it's kind of a disappointing answer to your question, but what I would say is most of the films that depict the future, and I've seen a number of them recently with my wife, and she would remember the names, they're typically dystopian. Things go wrong. Uh, you see the Black Mirror depictions, and so it's interesting. I think it's
Yeah.
because people look around and they see, well, the environment is degrading and we don't seem to be taking the right measures. The United States is going in exactly the opposite direction right now. It's really scary. And then we project our fears. So I would say, let me also, sorry, I'm wandering because you asked a very specific question, but I would say going back forever, there has been these two drives. There's the drive toward living forever and the drive toward death. The idea that living forever would not be attractive. It's freakish or
Yeah.
it's not human. So literature has always uh, bifurcated or reflected these two elements. If you go back to one of the first books, literary books, let's say 4,000 years ago, like 2,000 years before the historical Jesus, there was the famous Babylonian story of Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And he wanted immortality because he saw his friend die. He was a soldier and he really felt that was a transformative, horrible experience for him, the friend. For him and also, of course, the friend. But the problem was everything he tried failed. He tried, you know, various things, potions, practices, regimens, and they all were promising at first and they failed. So that novel kind of started things going, and you have the pro immortality side, but also the anti with Marlowe's Faust, for instance, and a whole bunch of other depictions. I'd say in contemporary pop culture, you have both, but now the dystopian side is winning. And it's not just the environmental doom, but the worries about robots and AI. Maybe I should just say, and then I'll stop, maybe it's just more intriguing and fascinating and gripping to present the worries and the horrors and try and wrap our mind around them and maybe resolve them or maybe not. You have a recent, depiction of some of the problems uh, with the people who are leading the AI charge and the relationship between those people and the immortality urge in Mountainhead, a film that was streaming on Max, HBO Max, and I think it's still available. Mountainhead, obviously a play on Ayn Rand's title, Fountainhead. And it depicts some of the excesses and ugly sides of the desire for radical life extension. So I don't think everyone feels that way. And I think actually, if you just polled people, my own view is it would be equal or more people would want immortality. But the literary and the films and novels tend to be negative.
Yeah. Yeah, I always try to explain it. It's my pet theory is that death is almost like a Stockholm syndrome situation, right? It's like your kidnapper. And, from what we have available now, it's an inevitability, right? So it has
Right,
it in your grips. So that means you need to kind of rationalize it as something, good, right? Because you
yeah,
can't
good,
justify the self-image that you're going towards something that's bad or are naturally kind of bound to something that is bad or will eventually
right,
like kill or
right.
die you. So
Excellent, excellent. I hadn't quite put it in those terms of the Stockholm syndrome, but something like that, I think, has got to be right. That we come to grips with it. We don't fight it because it would be too difficult psychologically. We kind of try to accept it, and religion is one way, I think, of doing that. Although it presents a positive possibility or hope in the afterlife, but you accept death. Uh, One thing that I just wanted to mention is there's a famous book by Gerald Grumman written in the 60s, and he goes back to the history of thought on immortality, and he identifies these two urges, but what he calls them are the proponents of longevity, called prolongivists, and the proponents of the status quo and the undesirability of immortality, he called apologists. And that word kind of fits with your idea. They're apologists for the status quo. They say, no, we wouldn't want that other thing. And part of being an apologist is you just try and come to grips with something because you are concerned that wanting the other thing will be too painful.
yeah, so in that way, I think of like often also kind of as an innovation, right? Innovation always has it really hard in the beginning because we reject something that we don't know, right? What we don't know, we don't trust. Right? And therefore we kind of reject it, which kind of happens
Yes,
to everything that's new, right? Sort of to the internet, to AI now, to crypto, to like even
right,
bicycles back then. There's this really great Twitter account called the Pessimist Archive, which was basically showing that every single new technology in the beginning, everyone was kind of like, no. And that's, I think, also where longevity or life extension is, right? Um,
right.
which, yeah,
I
which would
agree.
then kind of lead, yeah, yeah. And that would kind of lead then to the theory of change that we would just kind of make it consumable or make it something that people can actually benefit from, right?
Right,
So rather than sort of rationally trying to convince them, and we have to convince
right,
ourselves that this is possible and desirable, but then we really have to work on making it work for people, and then people adopt the new technology and
right,
get used to it, and it's just okay. I take this
right,
pill, I live a bit longer and
right,
healthier. So
right. I agree. That's right. The change is scary, and I do think that we need to think about the dangers, let's say, of a new technology as well as the possible benefits. And often there's this technological imperative. If we can do something, then we do it. And some of the gene editing technologies and some of the AI stuff is worth pausing and thinking, should we could do that, but as human beings, are we capable of controlling it and managing it? And, or, until we can think through those constraints or those ideas, maybe we shouldn't plunge forward. But I agree that um, we need to make new technologies that can help us. And if we were always putting the brakes on, we'd never really enjoy the ride, you could say, or get anywhere. So yeah, it's a mixed bag. I think you see this most saliently right now in the AI debates, right? That's where, even more than the longevity debates, though people are beginning to think more about aging and the possibilities of curing it. But AI is the most salient, where we see incredible benefits you can get from AI, but we also see dangers. And as you know, the rationalists have kind of come to the conclusion that it's going to be doomed. But um, at the same time, it's just going forward, right? It's just going forward. People have concerns, but we're not halting. So anyway, you see
Yeah.
the dichotomy, especially with AI, and we'll see where that leads us.
Yeah. Have you thought about that question, right? Because AI, right, probably also touches with on your work on free will, right? So, I always find, or I tend to find that many of the rationalists or AI engineers or people um, kind of assume usually the deterministic view on free will, which
Mm-hmm.
is why it's easier for them to make the jump to attribute agency to AI or
Right,
desires,
right,
which is kind of a jump that I find, a
right.
bit, right?
Problematic. Yes, yes, yes. I think it's too quick to just jump to the conclusion that, or the idea that artificial objects or bots, uh, even software, even software that works isometrically to the human brain, or it's basically orthogonal functionally. It's not made of the same stuff as our wetware, but it functions like our wetware. That you can infer from the functional isomorphism to a mental similarity, that they have consciousness, they have mental states. I'm not ruling it out. I just think it's a question mark, and you can be a certain kind of determinist who's also, you could say, a reductionist about the mind might be more inclined to jump to the idea that AI bots and so forth could be conscious. But it's complicated, and I think the issues, the considerations go both ways. In analytic philosophy, it kind of goes back to the famous paper by Alan Turing about computer intelligence. They used the term intelligence at the beginning of AI. That was kind of the beginning, and they used AI, that term, a little differently from the way in which we use it now. But the idea would be, could an, an artificial thing like a computer, could it think? Could it have mental states and consciousness? He wrote a paper, appropriately enough, published in the journal called Mind, which is a famous British journal, published in 1950, so 75 years ago. And he argued yes, and he presented what's become called the Turing test. And it was basically anything that functions like a human being has mental states. And then that's been debated and criticized. There's a famous article by John Searle and another Berkeley professor, actually, um, arguing that passing the Turing test, i.e., being functionally equivalent or even better than a human being, doesn't in itself imply mental states or consciousness. And he gave the famous Chinese room experiment. So in philosophy, it goes back and forth. There's legitimate considerations on both sides. You could say John Searle was a famous, influential critic of Turing, and Daniel Dennett, a famous, influential proponent or defender of the Searle of Alan Turing. Alan Turing. Um, so uh, yeah, I myself am not on one side or the other. I'm open to the idea that if AI bots become more and more sophisticated and they function more and more like the human brain, I'm open to the possibility that they could be conscious. It'd be really hard to kind of test that hypothesis. So, but I don't think it's obvious they are. Um, yeah, so that's, and now as to free will, again, it's an open question to me. When you think about how we function, I have my ideas about free will, and I think free will is compatible with determinism and materialism, but the determinism has to work in a certain way. Uh, there's a famous book now called Determined by the neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky, Stanford neuroscientist, a primatologist, but also a neuroscientist. And he argues that determinism is true and that implies no free will. I think both claims are dubious, or at least open to serious doubt. I think determinism might or might not be true, but I think if it were true, if it works its way through our minds and bodies in the right way, we could still be free. And I think of freedom as a kind of reasons responsiveness. We are responsive to perturbations in our environment. We're not just tropistic. And but it's not just perturbations or environmental changes; it's reasons. We can grasp reasons as reasons, and we can respond appropriately to them. And that capacity helps to make us free. That could be there in a deterministic world. Now, can we extrapolate that to artificial objects? Yeah, that's where, again, it's not straightforward. People have actually employed some of the ideas that I have developed to understand and operationalize the ideas in the control of technology, or something like missiles or cars that we can control. They've tried to understand whether those objects could be exercising a kind of free will by asking whether they are functioning like what I call free will. And I think the question's still an open question. So I hate to be so wishy-washy. So I think the idea of artificial consciousness and mental states is still open. And I think the idea of artificial free will is still open. I wouldn't rule it out. And what I think is promising is to use the best models that we have developed for the mind and for free will and try and extrapolate them or try and apply them and see how far you get.
Yeah. It was just on the question of consciousness, to maybe to explain to our listeners what we mean by that, right? So when you're saying consciousness is not equal something that emerges kind of from adding a couple of functions or capabilities on top of each other, right?
Yeah.
It's not because you can do all these things or you can like make choices between different options. That's not the same thing as consciousness, right? Consciousness, we might not currently be able to explain what exactly it is, but it's reasonable to assume that it exists, right? And as Thomas Nagel's famous "What It's Like to Be a Bat," there's sort of a qualia of you experiencing your consciousness or being conscious, right? That we currently, and of course, that's what also was John Searle saying, is of course somewhat materially embedded, right? So he was speaking out like against mind-body dualism, right? But sort of the functional idea of, okay, let's stack these functions on top of each other, that doesn't give you consciousness, right? That seems unlikely.
Right. Not in itself. You'd have to argue that once the functionality becomes complex enough, not just complex, but complex in the way that our functioning is, then maybe consciousness emerges. And I think you referred to an important paper, "What It's Like to Be a Bat" by the American philosopher Thomas Nagel. And basically the idea that there's something it's like to be conscious. A conscious experience is qualitative, or there's a subjective qualitative experience or something that it's like. Now, that you could, various philosophers of mind have distinguished different kinds of consciousness. You see this in Daniel Dennett and also in David Chalmers. So they both think there's a kind of consciousness that just is defined functionally. You can take information in from your environment. You can adjust your behavior in terms of that new information, like a heat-seeking missile, for instance, or a Waymo automobile. You can detect phenomena and respond to them. That's a kind of consciousness, but that's not what Chalmers says. Is there's a harder problem. He calls it the hard problem of consciousness, and that's to explain what it is over and above appropriate reactions to changes in the environment, what it is that adds to it that makes it the case that it's like something to be you, it's like something to be me, it's like something to be in pain, it's like something to have pleasure.
Yeah.
So that's really what consciousness is. And the question is whether an artificial, I guess you could say, being an artificial thing could have consciousness in that more robust sense, that it could be like something. And that's where I think it's just unclear. Now, one of the problems will be how we test that. I don't know operationally how we would ever test it. This is the problem of the hard problem, according to David Chalmers. And David Chalmers has developed the idea of zombies more in contemporary philosophy than others, although that idea goes back a long way. But the idea of a zombie is functionally equivalent to us, behaviorally equivalent in all ways. So even including verbal behavior, if you ask the zombie, well, does it look different when you look at a ripe banana and a ripe apple? Does it look different? Oh, yes, of course. And can you pick out tomatoes and distinguish them from oranges? Yes, yes, yes. And they can do that. Does it feel like something to be in pain when you put your hand on the hot burner? Does it feel bad? Do you pull your hand away? Yes, yes, yes. It's possible that there be a zombie, that they could have functional equivalents, including verbal behavior, and not actually have internal states. So the hard problem is to try and figure out what you have to add to functionality, which would be the Turing test, what you have to add to get a what it's like property.
Yeah. When I have these debates, I'm always like also an entrepreneur and a founder, right? And I'm always like, this matters so much when you do
Yeah,
build an AI company, right? Because we set ourselves like these very low goals, and everyone wants to build like super intelligent or whatever. But it's like, very often some of these questions, technologists don't really think about them very hard, right?
right,
So they're
right,
excited by sort of the capability of the machine, and they kind of try to expand from that and tinker that, which is great because that gives us a lot of progress. But I think it makes a very big impact how you answer some of these questions in terms of
yeah,
what you can actually build, right?
yes,
Which is why I'm always like on this podcast, my background being in philosophy, like, guys, you build something as entrepreneurs,
yes,
you have to answer these questions and go sort of to
right.
the deepest level and to the level of philosophy.
I agree.
Um,
I agree.
yeah,
Yeah, it's
feel free
like
to,
again, the concern about the technological imperative. That term goes back way back to the 1980s and 90s, where we start developing new technology, but we don't stop to think about its implications and ramifications, and whether we should continue or kind of put the brakes on until we can figure it out. Also, the whole idea of trying to understand the nature of what we're building. Like, again, AI is just going to go, it's going to continue. But whether the bots have consciousness or free will, whether they have moral rights, that's part of what's at the fundamental level. Those are questions that aren't technological or scientific questions. They're questions about ethics and political philosophy. And I guess people are going to differ, but when I step back and reflect, I think those are incredibly important parts of human life. And uh, right,
yeah, for sure. Um, I was wondering, what's your take on sort of Silicon Valley's pursuit of radical life extension, or the kind of version of
yeah,
it that you're seeing, or an ending death? Is
right,
there kind of some blind spots that you're seeing?
yeah. And it's interesting that the plutocrats, the billionaires in Silicon Valley, but also Russian billionaires and others have for a long time uh, wanted immortality. And I think it's partly because first of all, their lives are good in many ways. Their opportunities are more are larger than ours. Their lives are in many ways good, although often they're spiritually vacant or unhappy. As we know, money doesn't make you can't buy happiness, although it can be helpful. I think the lack of money can get in the way of happiness. But these people's lives are great in many ways, and so it's natural they would want it. Also, they have the resources to pursue it. Uh, Again, in the film Mountainhead is very dystopian and basically uh, not very uh, disguised that it's about people like Elon Musk. Elon Musk may be the protagonist in this film, but not just Musk, but Bill Gates, not Bill Gates, but some of the other uh, billionaires who are chasing immortality. Uh, it's about their spiritual and moral deficiencies. And right, I think the idea that you should pursue life extension with no question about quality of life. Uh, you know, we distinguish between health span and lifespan. I also like to think there's something called fun scan, which just means some people worry about Brian Johnson and they think, well, he's just pursuing extension, but his life is so weird and unpleasant that he doesn't have the fun. But so even if he has extension and he has health span, maybe he's not enjoying his life. But so if we add, now, I don't think that's necessarily true. I think maybe he does have a lot of joy. I think recently saw the documentary Don't Die about him. Uh, but the idea that we we should fetishize longevity, even fetishize health, without any question about what longevity and health should lead to, is a problem. And it's parallel to the fetishization of money, right? What is money? Uh, it's ideally something that gives you opportunities, so allows you to pursue your projects and to be comfortable and to, yeah. So it's not an end in itself, but it's a means. Unfortunately, there's a kind of sickness that some people have, or a distortion, according to which they fetishize money. They just think it in itself is valuable, which I think is a problem. I'd say the same problem afflicts some of the billionaires, the
Yeah.
Silicon Valley billionaires. They fetishize longevity and health, and they leave out the idea of what it should lead to.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a problem. I'm not saying they all are like that, or even the ones that have that challenge. I'm not saying that that's the dominant part of their lives, but we are human beings, and what's important, in my view, is finding love and finding friendship and pursuing meaningful projects. And if money and if health span gives us those opportunities, great. But um, if you just want health span or money for its own sake, then that's a problem.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. The one thing I think it's always important to think about is like, who do you give access to this technology, right? So I
Right.
think David Friedman once made, I find an interesting argument, longevity or mortality for dictators, right?
Yeah.
That
Right.
can be a problem, right? So,
Yeah.
you
Yeah. Yeah. That joke is always, no good person ever dies of cancer. Sorry, no bad person. Sorry about that. No
yeah,
bad person, no tyrant. It's always the good people. Probably not true, but it's kind of equally distributed. Um,
what
yeah.
if Putin gives you like $1 billion for life extension, right?
Right. No. 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 Yeah. I don't. Right. And unfortunately, one of the big issues, and it's more an applied or practical issue. That doesn't mean it's not important. is about inequity, social and economic inequities and injustices, and how that relates to the healthcare opportunities, and also specifically the technology that would enable greater and greater longevity. And people have pointed out already in most societies, and the US, unfortunately, is a salient example of a society in which access to healthcare is very unequal. Very unfortunate feature of America. And if you think of the medical resources and technology that would enable life extension, radical life extension, if you think of that as a great good, one of the greatest goods, or the end state, and therefore the technology that is the means to it, if now that it will obviously be very expensive, if then that technology is only available to a small group, it will exacerbate the social and economic injustices. It will magnify them and accelerate them, and it will increase the sense of unfairness in society. So that's a big challenge, I think, that we have to deal with. In this regard, I'd commend a book by John Davis, who's a philosopher, a California philosopher, who wrote a book called The New Methuselahs, and it's about the longevity movement, the philosophical and more applied aspects of it. But he takes on this issue, and I take it on. I have a debate book with another philosopher called Stephen Cave. The debate book is called Should You Choose to Live Forever? It was published a year and a half ago. And we go back and forth about this, and he's really concerned about the injustice problem. But what I would ask us to think about is the following, that there are inequalities in life, and there are inequalities that come from imperfect social institutions. Even if our governments and our social institutions were perfect, it wouldn't eliminate all the injustices that come from nature and biology. And we're different. We live in uh, we live in social niches that are the result of a social lottery. We didn't control who our parents were, etc., and a natural lottery of our genes and our natural abilities. And so there will be inequities or inequalities. And part of the job of uh, politics and social institutions is to damp down those inequalities, to reduce the impact of luck on our life process, but not necessarily to get rid of them entirely. Because if getting rid of an inequality would actually make everyone worse off, you don't want to just focus on that
Yeah.
inequality.
And
So the
another thing
idea,
that also, yeah,
right,
and
right,
another thing that libertarians also like to say is many of these solutions that we have, like against inequality, is causing it in the first place.
yeah, it's
Right.
making it
So,
work. Yeah,
yeah, so in drug development or in healthcare, the fact that we make the drug development process so expensive
right,
means that the companies have to charge super high prices to
right,
recoup, right?
right,
And
right. It
also
makes
that
it,
we give yeah, and you give this patent IP also makes people in the third world get less access to it because the
right,
companies go after them for IP infringement. And
yeah,
versus, if we pursue sort of the more permissionless libertarian
right,
route of all access, then we get things like Ozempic, right? So
right,
it's not doesn't have any more patent protection, it can be produced
right,
really, really cheap. So it gives a very large number of people access to this technology
right.
now.
I totally agree. So it's a complex issue. And if you just think about it, like heart transplants, um, we can't give everyone access to heart transplants. It's expensive, and hearts are scarce. But does that mean that we should give no one access to it? And similarly with medicines, we develop medicines and it costs a certain amount to develop it. So we allow for higher prices. Whether that's desirable or the extent to which it's allowed, whether that's desirable is an open question. I agree. But just because we can help someone does not mean that we should help no one. Just because we can only help a minority does not mean we should help no one. So it becomes complicated. And uh, the way I look at it, just kind of stepping back, okay, we have social and economic inequalities and injustice, and we have a healthcare system in most countries that is unequal. The first thing we should do is address those inequalities. We shouldn't say, our health care system is bad, therefore we shouldn't pursue longevity for anyone. What we should say is, let's make our healthcare system better. Okay, that doesn't mean that it should be more heavily regulated, but we should make it more fair. And then by offering the medicines and supplements and technologies of radical life extension, it's not so problematic because it's not happening. It's not piggybacking on a terribly unjust system. So it's very simple to me is we have social and economic injustice. We need to rectify that. We have racism, we have sexism, we have prejudice against gay people and trans people. And when you add in certain, like medical care and access to luxury goods, it then exacerbates the basic unfairness. But common sense would say, well, let's go after those basic facts. Anyway, now that's not to say that we shouldn't also pursue the research, but you shouldn't shut down the research because we have these other problems.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, these are all like very important questions for entrepreneurs and technologists to ask themselves, right? Which is
Yeah,
always why I really like to, continue following my passion and bring philosophers like you on this podcast to think about
right,
these things,
right,
because the answers to these questions make a huge impact on whether what you're building or not, what impact it can ultimately have, right? And we're
right,
in an environment in technology where one person or the team of or the team can make huge impacts, right? So the
right,
Nobel Prizes that have been won for several discoveries, mRNA, human genome sequencing, or penicillin back in the days,
right.
like. And that just makes a huge difference what the views are of the people involved, as we see now also with AI. Um, so, John, I really enjoyed this conversation. I think our listeners will as well. I'm talking about these very big and important questions. Is there anything else you want to give our listeners on the way in terms of where they can find out more about your
Well,
work, read up more about some of these questions that we talked
right.
about?
Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation too, and I'm committed to learning more and more about lobbying efforts and the practical efforts that are being made because philosophers also can help in this process. One, I guess, one thing I'd like to do, I'll make available to Niklas, I'll make available to you a link to some of my podcasts and interviews and books on death and immortality and free will. So people could look at that and pick and choose. But I'd say one good resource would be the debate book. It's called Should You Choose to Live Forever? It's Stephen Cave, who's a very interesting British philosopher and the director now of an institute at Cambridge University called, I think it's Center for the Future or Study of Future Technology. So it's very interesting. It deals with AI and also longevity. And he's arguing the negative. He's arguing that we should not choose to live forever. And I'm at the more optimistic uh, proponent of immortality. But we go through the different philosophical issues and the different ethical, political issues having to do with radical life extension. And it's very accessible. And there are suggestions for further readings and availability of further resources. So that would be a good place to look. And it's written in an accessible way. It's a paperback that's fairly inexpensive, and you can also get it used, I think. So anyway, that would be a good place, and I'll send you the links. And one last thing is now, finally, there's not just philosophy about death and life extension, but there are medical and technological innovations that make it increasingly possible. So now, finally, we have an opportunity to bring the two worlds together in ways that will benefit both of us.
Fantastic. John, thank you so much
Okay.
for coming on the show. And
Okay.
hope to see you soon in Prosper or in Montana, wherever
Yeah,
this journey
I'd like
to
to.
bring life extension to the world takes us.
Thank you. Thank you.